Welcome to the Bullish Drive podcast, where faith meets mental performance. Let this be your guide on a journey of growth and resilience. Each week, we dive into conversations with top performers, exploring the mindset and faith that fuel their successes. This is the Bullish Drive podcast. Here we are back. It's episode number 2 of season 3 of the Bullish Drive podcast. And guys, thank you so much for just supporting the channel, supporting the podcast, and just most importantly, growing your wisdom, your mindset skills, and your toolbox. Because I always like to say, you can't hammer a nail in with a screwdriver. You got to have the right tools. And that's what we're here to do, is just grow your toolbox. So last week we talked with Ariana Ramsey, who was part of the Olympics, who helped the women's team get their first medal. And this week, we're going to dive into the process getting there. And I am specifically talking about motivation. And most importantly, how does motivation grow? How do you build it? What does it really mean to be motivated? What are the different aspects, whether it's getting consistently good sleep, whether it's eating well, whether it's engaging in the appropriate amount of leisurely activities amongst hard work? How do you stay motivated? And, there's that saying that motivation doesn't start after the first step. It starts after the second step. It's the thing that keeps you going. David Goggins would say, it's not what you do when you're motivated. It's what do you do when you're unmotivated? How do you build that? And today's guest has a passion for motivation. He's a psychologist, a doctor who has worked with Olympians all over the world. And he dives into this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So guys, I am super stoked about this conversation. There's so much knowledge and wisdom that's shared today, and just coping skills in general. So I hope you get out of it as much as I did and listen through the whole thing, because today I have Dr. Adam Formal on the podcast. Super stoked to have you on, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, James.
Yeah. So first, let's kind of just start off with what interests you about, mental skills, coping skills, or what's your background? Let's start there. What is your background when it comes to mental health?
Okay. Yeah. So funny enough, up until college, I wasn't even thinking about mental health at all as a career. Okay. I was president of my investment club, and I was going purely, for a business degree. Okay. And in college, I saw this psychology class, and I thought it would be like an easy grade. I heard good things about it, so I sat in there, and the first lecture had me hooked, and I haven't looked back ever since. So
I love it. I love it. So, okay. So was there something about the lecture? Was there one word? Was there a concept that was just like, you know what, this is my thing? What was it? What got you hooked?
Yeah, so I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a professor who I continue to be in contact with, and I was his TA for many years. But that first class he brought up, it was an abnormal psychology class.
Oh, yes.
And he was talking about, he was talking about a case study. And what I thought was so interesting about it is he described this person who's going through the throes of, a really serious acute crisis. And what he was able to do so well through the narrative of telling about this case was he talked about these behaviors that seem so foreign to most people's everyday experience. And then he was able to weave that person's life history in a way where you could kind of empathize and relate with the other person. So he was able to take this experience that, again, just so foreign from what you or I would ever, or most people would ever experience, and then find a way to connect and make this narrative that you could say, oh my gosh, I can understand why they are the way they are.
Yeah.
And that had me hooked. I just, I couldn't
That's
get
so
enough.
good. That's so good. And in crisis, I feel like when it comes to athletics, sometimes crisis is the catalyst to going into sports, right? Or to going into music or whatever it is, that high performance. Can you speak a little bit on that? Just how sometimes that can motivate someone to do sports, and some other people just struggle to process that and get through it.
Sure. I think that, sports are a very interesting venue. I think it makes it so different than most other careers.
Yeah.
First of all, the timeline, the career arc. Hopefully I can do my career for for decades to come. But with an athletics career, there's usually a really short timeline, and especially with professional sports, your average NFL player is has under a 4-year career. Same thing with NBA, it's about the same. And so knowing that you have that timeline, I think it's this double-edged sword. On one hand, it can add pressure, but on the other hand, it has this way of taking away pressure, because it's a way of saying to yourself, well, I have to make the most of this moment. So I have to put everything in. I have to be able to pour myself into my activity with everything I've got, and take that leap of faith that I'm going to, make the most of it.
Yeah, that's so good. And that starts tying into something you're really passionate about, which is motivation, right? Like, how do you motivate yourself? And like David Goggins, he said, like, the secret to a champion is not what you do to get motivated, but what you do when you're unmotivated, right? So what is that? What gets people to flip the switch, per se, to become motivated? Let's start there.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of people think of motivation as either like high or low, and you're either motivated or you're not. And I think in many ways that couldn't be further from the truth. That I think there are a lot of things in life that can motivate us, but it's how we feel as a result of engaging in that way that means the most. So for instance, you don't have to tell a child to play, they just do. And at the end of playing, they might be tired, but they feel accomplished, they feel vitality, they feel good about themselves. They're intrinsically motivated to do it. And that is so different than something that's extrinsically motivated. So if, for instance, someone gives you a lot of money to do a job that you don't want to do, maybe you feel very strongly motivated to doing that, but it's only enough to get the paycheck. And it's not something that makes you feel good about who you are or proud about what you do. And there's a toll that you pay for doing that, engaging in that way for so many hours of a day. Because if you don't feel as good, you're going to want to maybe tune out. You're going to want to numb yourself, possibly. You're going to want to do other things to kind of not think about it. You might feel, instead of accomplished and vitality, you might feel drained. You might feel stuck. And so we can tell ourselves these kinds of stories around, I can just do it, till the next day. I can get through this day. I can get through this day. But when those days add up, we really pay a very heavy price for engaging in a way that we don't want to live for a long period of time. Man,
yeah, it's so good. Now that kind of plays out. There's a chemical aspect to motivation. Right? Like sometimes we've talked about like dopamine, and norepinephrine as like these kind of chemicals that compete against each other. Are you comfortable kind of talking a little bit about that?
Well, so while it's not like my expertise per se, what I will say is that I think it feels good, and whatever that means on the biochemical side underneath, it feels good to get to be in congruency with what it is that's important and passionate, you're passionate about, and what's important to you. And so when you get rewarded by that, especially the sooner you get rewarded after doing something, the more likely you are to continue. And so we're always looking for ways to evaluate our surroundings, and how we're rewarded or how we're not rewarded always plays a significant role.
That's so good. And especially my mind instantly goes to like this instant gratification culture that we're into right now. And also this over glorification of just like, this money thing like this. And you mentioned it right at the beginning that made me think about it. It's like, you do it for the paycheck, but there's more of a motivator than just the money. So how is this like instant gratification culture and this hyper focus on like making the money affecting our motivation in today's society?
That's a great question, James. So I'll say this. According to self-determination theory, there are it's a theory of motivation. There are three basic psychological needs that we need to fulfill in order to have well-being. And it counts for the vast majority of the variance, which means just the biggest percentage of what means, what we think about when we think about well-being. And those are autonomy, feeling like you are able to engage in a way that is congruent with what you are thinking and feeling, competence, that you're getting better at something, and relatedness, connecting meaningfully with others. And so when you get those needs met, there's a tendency to feel real well-being. When there is a dearth in one or more of those, that's when we tend to engage in need substitutes. And so that can manifest in a variety of different ways. So if, for instance, someone is promoting something on social media just to get likes and not because they truly enjoy the content, there is an example of feeling like a pseudo connection. And so maybe they might try to find connection in other ways and continue to do that, but it doesn't end up fulfilling one of those three basic psychological needs. The same thing can be true for autonomy, that maybe someone feels like they don't have a lot of choice in their life and they feel like it's being dictated by others. And so maybe they'll try to engage in a need substitute by, cleaning the room so they feel some semblance of autonomy over something that they actually can control more easily than some of like the more wider spheres. And so how people engage in need substitutes are usually a representation of whether or not they're getting those basic needs met in the first place.
Oh man. So let's say you're a parent of a student athlete that's seeing this stuff. Cause I see it in some athletes, that are super gifted, right? But now they're thrust into these environments that are way beyond maybe their developmental level, their emotional level. And they're like, oh, I don't know how to control all this. So then they hyper control their rooms, they clean it all the time, stuff like that. So if a parent sees this, how do you balance, like, we want our kids to have the most opportunity, but also let them still be kids, and develop?
That is the big question there. I think first and foremost, I think there's a big difference between what it feels like to have control of your situation versus what it means to have certain guardrails put into place that are meaningful and helpful. Okay. So for instance, if you tell a child, don't touch the hot stove because you're going to get burned, most kids don't see that as like confining or controlling or negatively impacting their behavior in some way, because it aligns with their own interests.
Right.
But it's very different than if you tell a child, I don't want you going to soccer class anymore. And so therein lies the differences. When are guardrails put into place when it aligns with what the athlete wants, and when is it just feel punitive or not in congruence with what they actually want? So I think the heart of it is really asking them, how are you feeling about this? What are the things that you like about it? What are the things that you don't like about it? Are you willing to make these kinds of choices? What does it mean to make this choice? What are the pros and cons? And have them really think it through, because there might be elements in which a parent can kind of foreshadow, well, if you do this, these are the potential consequences, and pros and cons of doing it this way versus that way. And so really it's more of a thinking through rather than sort of saying you should do this or you should do that. That's good. I think something that parents often do, in just my experience, is they try to sugarcoat it, right? They try and sugarcoat the truth. How much value is it just to be kind of honest about the situation with your student athletes? I think honesty is an incredibly important feature of being a good parent, coach, or mentor, because it's not only modeling what you're hoping for in developing a student athlete or a child, but it's also about giving realistic expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And so much can come into play when someone does not have a realistic expectation of themselves, whether it be too low or too high.
Yeah, that's good. And we talked about kind of the developmental stages a little bit. And I mean, I don't know how much you relate with like Erickson's stages of social development, and I grew up on being a big fan of it. You know, our kids are going through these stages, right? And what they're trying to accomplish in their own social development identity is very different through each stage, you know, and while they can move on to the next stage without resolving it, you know, how do we move through that, you know, especially when you're looking at an 8-year-old and then now like a 10 and 11-year-old and then now a teenager and now a college student. How do parents keep up with those stages in a world that's still very, you know, structured and very like these are the rules and this are the expectations?
Another really great question. I can see how you're thinking about, you know, how do we optimize for a person?
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of whether you call it the golden mean or whether you call it, there's a fellow by the name of Lev Vygotsky who talked about social scaffolding.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, in essence, I think we're talking about that, which is if you make a task too easy, kids going to get bored. They're not going to do anything. If you make a task too hard, they get frustrated and they don't do anything. And so how is it that you create that meaningful reach where they feel like they're able to stretch themselves and grow, but not so much so that it feels like it's too far for them to go, or too easy where they're just not going to be involved? So I think it's really the art of a good mentor, teacher, or parent to be able to say, well, where is that meaningful stretch? And how do I keep raising the bar in a way that is consistent with what I think and feel about this person or this child, this student athlete?
Yeah. And that makes me think about the age-old question of participation awards. And you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but what are your thoughts about participation awards?
I think, all right, I'll say this. I think there is so much of a value in commending a person for showing up. And I think it is one of the hardest things to do is to take those first steps toward doing something. And so I think there is a value in meaningfully rewarding someone for showing up, for getting there, for doing it. Because when we look at society, we see the ways in which, you know, real accomplishments are awarded, and then sort of nothing in the middle. And so I think that it makes people afraid to even try.
Yeah.
And so I think there is so much of a value in saying, you know what, you worked out today, or you got this thing accomplished today. That's great. How do we string these things together? Because that's how we eat the elephant, one bite at a time. We take these different steps over time, and we're able to then see progress and growth over these like small changes every day that may not be, you know, celebrated in the same way as an ultimate accomplishment of, you know, writing a book or getting a degree or a certain job, but it's all of these everyday efforts that we take towards those big goals that really are worthy of celebration.
Yeah, that's good. And that goes back to your original statement about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? So how, with those two different types of motivations, how can that develop that, you know, one little step at a time, versus if it's from coming within you or something rewarded outside of you?
I think one, using your gut as a guide is incredibly helpful. So it's when you engage in a habit or an activity, how does it feel afterwards? Is this something that, you know, sparks joy? Is this something that makes you feel good? Is this something that makes you feel valued? Is it connecting to those basic needs that we have of autonomy, competence, relatedness. And if we can do that, then it's about first recognizing it and then thinking about what we can do to do more of it. And then the opposite is true for when it doesn't. You know, what happens when you realize that you're using substances as a way of just numbing out, and that it's not necessarily addressing the problems that you're looking to face. And so how is it getting in the way of what it is that you really want and are intrinsically motivated to do?
Man, that feels like a process to figure that out. Man, my 11-year-old mind would be like, what? What's going on here? But that's so good. And you mentioned taking steps a little bit at a time, and you know, it makes me think of a quote by Tim Grover, who coached Michael Jordan, and he said motivation, or the hardest step, isn't the first one, it's the steps afterwards. So like, how do you keep going afterwards? What type of motivation helps you keep going after you take that first step?
Yeah. Another really great question. I won't say that this is a universal, but I think that for many folks, what it means to compare yourself to yourself versus what it means to compare yourself to others. Because
that's good.
If you're comparing yourself to others, you stop as soon as you're better than everyone else. And so that can be true locally, if you're the best chess player or the locally the best soccer player, versus what it means to be the best version of yourself. Because if you are always comparing yourself to a potentially better version of yourself, then growth is no longer like, okay, I reached this accomplishment, or I reached this goal, or I beat this person. But it's really a lifetime of self-improvement. It's an infinite game. It's not something with static ends, but something that we're continuing to work towards. And so trying to get rid of the idea of, well, I reached this milestone, done. But instead saying, how do I look at this continuous progress of growth? And how do I make that a part of just who I am?
Yeah, and that sounds like growth mindset, right? That sounds like shifting from outcome focus to growth mindset. And I think that's another big barrier in our culture today, because you talked about money, right? Making money. How do I get to the next paycheck? Or in sports, we talk about stats. How do I fill these stats, right? And what would you tell somebody who grew up in that environment, but wants to shift their mindset into that growth mindset? Are there steps that you feel like are the most beneficial to moving your thoughts into that place?
Yeah, I think there definitely are. And I think it comes down to the difference between what is like an intermediate step versus what is an immediate step.
Sure,
and what I mean by that is, so if we use the example of stats, right? If your goal is to get stats, you can collect stats, but not all stats are as valuable as others in terms of how they impact the game.
Yeah.
But if your goal is to impact the game, the stats will come.
That's good.
And so what it means if you try to go after stats, that might not end up in winning. But if you go after winning, the stats have to come. And so being able to shift the mindset around, well, what am I personally doing to, fill my sheet, versus what is the ultimate goal? And if we're talking about sports, if the goal is to win the game, then it's really about what do I do to win the game versus what do I do to fill my sheet. Yeah.
That's good, man. So clearly you have a great grasp of this motivation thing, right? Like, I could tell you have a great understanding. Is there, now you've traveled to work with athletes
Yes.
all over. I know you can't give like specific names or anything like that, but is there an example of a time when you saw somebody develop their motivation, develop their mindset to overcome these barriers and hurdles to reach their potential and their goals that they're looking for?
I mean, that's why I do the job.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that process. And so I can give you, he identified a pretty, I think, interesting example as well. So I was working with a national team, and we were competing abroad. And what happened was there was a joint practice between two of the junior teams.
Okay.
And one of the players in mid-practice fell on the field and had a seizure.
Oh, man.
And so that player was assessed, and it turned out that they had a brain tumor.
Oh my gosh.
So here we are, with a junior team of young athletes who are healthy, fit, whose biggest issues ever medically are usually a sprained ankle or maybe a broken arm or a broken finger. And here we are with a young man, with a very serious medical disorder. And so we had to put him on anticonvulsant medication before we sent him back to his home country. And what happened was the rest of the team was in shock because they never assumed that anything like that would happen to them, especially not at that age. I mean, these are, really fit individuals who are, young and healthy and just be a complete antithesis of, sick or, and it's the furthest thing from their minds, really. And so many of them were so in shock from this that they came to the conclusion, well, I don't know if we want to play anymore.
Oh, wow.
Because, one, out of concern of their friend, and two, just really hitting them in a way that they had never experienced before, that life can come at you in ways you never expect. And so what I did was I arranged a video call for the player that had the seizure and the rest of his team. And I talked to the individual player and I said, what would you want to be doing right now? And he said, if I could, I'd be out there playing. And that was the point where the rest of the team said, okay, we want to play. Because they realized in that moment that, yes, life can happen and we don't have control over that, but that is the purpose why they were there. That is the reason why they had trained for years to get up to this moment, to get up to this point. And they played such an inspired game as a result of that. And you could just see how differently recognizing how important the game was, and that renewed sense of life and vitality for their chosen sport. So that was one, I think, pretty memorable example.
Yeah. It just recognized just the blessing, the opportunity that they fought for, right? To bring it there. Wow. That's such a great story. What a great testimony. I mean, I'm like, feels good. I feel good after that story. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Man, that's so good. So I appreciate you sharing that story. We are running down to the end of our time right now. So is there any final thoughts or words you want to share with our listeners, our viewers, as far as motivation, just your story or things that you would want to suggest or encourage them about?
I guess in the spirit of that last story that I shared, I think that life can be short and life can be full of surprises. And I think it is so essential to try to tune into what matters most, and be able to think about the ways in which we can tip the scales in our life to be able to do more of what matters most. That we're not always guaranteed tomorrow, and we're not always able to do what we want all the time. But even in just little ways, shifting the scales to feeling and living a life that it has purpose to us.
That was great, Adam. I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Bullish Drive podcast. Thanks, Adam. And we'll see you guys very soon.
Thanks for having me.
I love this conversation. It's great. Continue to grow your motivation, your grit. Spend time just stepping into hard things. If you're where you're at today, it's because God meant you to be there, meaning you have the tools necessary to just trust that his plan is perfect and you'll overcome. So stick with us. We'll see you next week. Thank you guys for joining us for another episode of the Bullish Drive podcast. And always remember, it starts with you and your destiny is waiting. Peace.